I surveyed my YouTube audience and my Facebook group, and I asked you, what was your biggest watercolor painting mistake? Did you manage to fix it? Today we're going to talk about the results. Welcome back to my channel. On this channel we do all things watercolor, as well as drawing tutorials, even a little bit of mixed media. If that's something that you are learning, feel free to join us and hit that subscribe button. Now let's talk about these survey results. That was absolutely fascinating, as I expected. There were many repetitions. In other words, many people had the same issues. And I went through and took a look at the results and I narrowed them down. So we're going to work backwards. We're going to go from 7 down to 1 being the most common watercolor mistake. However, there's actually 10 mistakes. Now, my inability to do maths is legendary in these parts. However, I haven't miscounted this time because there were several that tied. In fact, we had a tied first place as well. And I had nearly 200 answers to these surveys. So it really is interesting and important information. Many of you told me how you fixed these problems or how you still were having trouble with them. I'll be doing a little bit of demonstrating for you as well. So let's go through these mistakes now, and we'll start with 7th place. So we had joint 7th place. There were 2 that came up in 7th place. Do forgive me if I look down at my desk occasionally or look at some notes. I'm of the age where I can't even remember what I went upstairs for, let alone do a whole video without looking at a few notes. And I've got some people's usernames written down. I've also got some comments written down. So let's look at the first one. And in first 7th place, we have fear of being bad. And Marlene says, I'm afraid of not being good enough. And not being good enough for who? Not being good enough for what? I think sometimes we start a hobby and we just kind of like, well, I'll just see how it goes. And then we start sort of having hopes that we might be really good at it, or hopes that we might be able to get really good at it. So the first thing is to define what you're trying to be good enough for, or who you're trying to be good enough for. If you're trying to be good enough for other people, in other words, good enough that nobody will ever criticize or mock your efforts, well, forget about that, because I still get all sorts of criticism, both about my teaching, my nail varnish colours, and also my artwork itself, because you can't ever please everybody and art is subjective. So if you're feeling like you need to be good enough for other people, then just forget about that straight away. But what about good enough for yourself? What is good enough for you? And when do you reach that point? So every day that you're painting, you're going to improve a little bit each day. So you don't have to worry really about being good enough for yourself now. You have to think about where you want to get to. So does your work need to be good enough to go on the wall? Does it need to be good enough that you just sort of can happily look at it without feeling unwell? Does it need to be good enough to go in an exhibition? Does it need to be good enough to give as a gift perhaps at Christmas? So I want you to sort of think about what your work needs to be good enough for, and to remember that we don't start out artwork being good. We don't start out anything being good. It's just the most amazing thing that people sort of take an art class or start painting and just think that they should be good straight away. It's absolutely crazy. I would like to learn to crochet, and next year I'm thinking about going on a one-day course to learn some crochet skills. But I won't turn up there expecting to be any good at it or expecting to already know how to do it, because I need to learn and I need somebody to teach me. So really think about what this worry means to you and have an idea of perhaps a little goal in your head so you've got something to work towards, and don't expect to get there on day 1. Now in joint 7th place was muddy colours, or not knowing how to mix colours accurately. There are actually many, many reasons for muddy colours, far more than I can cover in this YouTube video, but I do have another YouTube video that's entirely dedicated to the subject. Now I'm going to link that in the description of this video, but I'm also going to give you a few little hints and tips if you're just starting out on how to avoid mixing muddy colours. Now let's talk about muddy colours. Now, one of the first things you can do to avoid muddy colours is just to clean your palette. So here's one that I used some time ago. It's very mucky, particularly wells like this one. I would always clean this before I start a new project. Now you will get some artists on YouTube that will tell you that it really doesn't matter, and that, palette mud is fun and you can create a good painting without cleaning your palette. Now, can you make a good painting with a dirty palette? It is possible, yes, if you are an artist that has a very good idea of tonal contrast, because that's often the cause of muddy watercolors. And if you perhaps paint very loose, muted landscapes, you can get away with it, but it's just never a good idea. The other thing is to keep your water clean. Now, you want to be quite intentional about your water. I always have 2 water jars, one for the initial rinse and one for the second rinse. There are various strategies around water jars, but certainly you need to have more than one on the go. And it's quite important that you think about when you change your water. If I were going between this colour here and a purple, perhaps, I wouldn't really worry too much about changing my water. But if I were going between this and a green, which is a colour opposite, I would certainly think about changing my water because one will mute the other. You don't have to remember your colour opposites, but if you're going with a second colour that's just a lot different to the first, it's a good idea to change your water because it is going to affect how bright and clear your colours look. The next thing is just to get to know your colours. Now, it's a complete myth that there are any bad colours. I'm not talking about quality of paints here. We'll talk about that later in the video. But I'm talking about specific pigments. Here's yellow ochre, for example. It's quite a muted colour with a lot of granulation. It can be slightly opaque, but it's really useful for mixing into things like beaches. It may not be the right choice for a bright, clear yellow flower petal, because it's quite granular. Here's another muted colour. It's one of my favourites. This is raw umber. Now, it's a weak, granulating, dull colour, but it's fantastic for things like bleached wood. You can make mixes with greys that will give you concrete colours. There's nothing wrong with this colour, but I wouldn't advise mixing it in with other colours specifically. So it's not about avoiding colours that are muted or avoiding colours that are semi-opaque or that granulate. It's about understanding their properties and when you should be using them in your work. The very best way to get to know your colours is to make colour charts. Here's some Prussian blue. This is a strong staining colour. So it's quite dark and rich. It doesn't granulate very heavily. And when I water it down, it gets much lighter. So the first thing you should do is take each of your colours and swatch them so you can see how they look when they're light, you can see how they look when they're dark, you can see how bright and clear they are or how muted and granular they are. The next thing you want to do is take each of your colours and mix it with each of your other colours. A lot of water changing whilst we're doing this. Let me take some of that Prussian and mix it with some yellow ochre. So here I've got a green. It's quite a muted green. It's quite a warm green. It's quite a granular green. All of this contains properties from the 2 colours that I've mixed. And within this colour itself, there are many other colours. We could go more into the yellow. We could go more into the blue. And we could, of course, water it down. Making yourself colour charts and being clean with your colours will go a long way to avoiding muddy colours. As I said, there's a lot more to it than just colour. Much of what people see as muddy watercolours are often just watercolours with poor tonal contrast. I'm going to leave videos about both of those subjects. We'll be talking more about tonal contrast in a moment, but I'm going to leave videos about both of those subjects in the description of this video. You're going to find them really useful. In 6th place, we have using either too much or not enough paint. I do remember when I was teaching classes in real life before the pandemic, that I'd walk around and there'd always be that one person who was really, really stingy with their paints, just put out tiny little dots. So that can be an issue. Can also be an issue with pan paints, actually physically getting enough paint. And remember that you can mix tube and pan paints. You don't have to just stick to pan paints alone. If you have colours that you often need more of, for instance, blues for skies, you can get some tube colours to supplement so that you can put more paint out. What if you're using too much paint or laying it on too thick? And we have Carly, who said that she learned that once things dry, they look quite different. And this is true. If you've got a good quality paint, and we're going to talk more later in this video about the quality of your paints, but if you've got a good quality paint, you shouldn't need to layer it on thickly. And indeed, it can actually look less vibrant when you do that. And that's because watercolour is meant to glow with the white of the paper. So unless you've got some really, really strong darks that you need to put in, if you're going for sort of real rich, strong colours like reds, for example, in flower painting, they can actually look duller if you put the paint on more thickly. And the answer to this issue is, of course, that if you're consistently not using enough paint, consider swapping to tubes or adding some tubes, or just squeezing out more paint. If you're putting on too much paint, that's just something that you're going to get used to the more you practice. At this point in the video, as always, can I just ask you to quickly click that like button? Sharing really helps. It really helps my channel as well. So if you know somebody who's starting their watercolor journey and you think that this video will really help them, could you share this video with them, or even pop it into a Facebook group that you might be a member of? If you like, share, comment, or subscribe, it helps YouTube to push this video out to more people, and I can help more people learn how to paint and draw. So in fifth place, we have lack of tonal contrast. And Becky says, going too dark and losing the light values, still have to watch for this. Well, don't we all? I still have to watch for this. And, you know, even if you understand which light values to leave, it can be physically hard to do that. You can end up accidentally painting things. You know, this happens to me all the time. So it's good to err on the side of caution and leave more white and more light spaces at the beginning than you think that you might need. If you're a complete beginner, the easiest way to solve this problem is painting light to dark. Consider first of all where your white areas are going to be, whether you need to reserve those. And by reserve, I don't necessarily mean masking fluid. It can just be, you know, painting round areas, leaving them till later. Although it's possible to lift watercolor paint out in some instances, it's nearly always better to avoid going in with strong darks right at the beginning. Of course, another thing that can lead to losing values is actually things bleeding together. We'll talk more about that later on in this video. But if you're ever in doubt, always work light to dark and consider your whites and your light areas right from the start of the painting. So in fifth joint place, we have painting as if they were acrylics. Now, of course, this is only something that will happen to you if you have previously painted in acrylics, or perhaps you started painting in acrylics and then moved on to watercolor, or even started in oils and then moved on to watercolor. Watercolors do behave quite differently to other mediums. And one of the most noticeable ways that they behave differently is you don't use brush strokes as much in watercolor. There's all sorts of clever tricks for getting texture, but you don't normally leave visible brush strokes. And that's because watercolor continues to develop and move and bleed. And visible brush strokes can lead to all sorts of problems and don't always look very good, whereas in oils and acrylics, they might look very attractive indeed. Now, I'm leaving out some of the odd numbers and letters from some of these usernames. We've all got those usernames, haven't we? My daughter actually had an email address once that had the word pyromaniac in it when she was about 14, and she was using this email address to apply for jobs. She's very interested in fire, and I told her that was probably a bad idea. So we've got at Mazui and some random numbers and letters after that. As a beginner, I did not know that watercolor behaved differently than acrylics, so all the mistakes. Well, there you are. Yes, it is a very different medium, so you do have to take time to think about it. And of course, the most difference is the fact that you just use more water. And watercolor as well, I would say, is a lot more technique based than oils or acrylics. With oils and acrylics, you pretty much just put them on the canvas and they really kind of stay where you put them. And so with watercolor, it's a lot more important that we understand how the medium moves and how to control it. I'm going to be doing a demonstration of this later in this video, but you'll also find dozens of videos on this channel all about techniques. When you're first starting out, these are really important to learn. So in fourth place, we have lack of patience. And actually, as a tutor, I would say that lack of patience is probably one of the biggest mistakes that people make with watercolors. It's a really strange medium. You have to work very quickly, but you also have to be very slow and methodical. So what do I mean by that? I mean that I might spend 20 minutes planning a sky and getting all the colours ready and making sure I had the brush ready. Then I might spend 30 seconds applying that sky. So it's really a thoughtful medium. It's a medium where you simply do have to just walk away from it sometimes, and you have to think and you have to plan. Also, because you work light to dark, and it's actually not the only medium where you do work light to dark. If you've ever done any reduction lino printing, you'll find that you did the same in that. In fact, most mediums, I believe, are better worked light to dark. You can, of course, in things like oils, work dark to light. But for most mediums, it is my preference to work light to dark. So you do have to do a little bit of thinking and a little bit of planning, and really just have a little bit of patience. And on the subject of patience, Susan Lee says too much dabbing and scrubbing. Absolutely. Now, one of the hardest things to understand about watercolors is that when you make mistakes, sometimes you just have to leave them alone and let them dry before you deal with them. Actually, scrubbing at your paper can push mistakes further in. It also leads to uneven drying and uneven water levels, which can just make all of your mistakes much worse. I used to walk around an art class and constantly see people with bits of tissue paper or cloths dabbing at their work. You don't want to do this. Later in this video, I'm going to show you how to use that cloth in order to control how much water is on your paper at any time. But as soon as you place something on your paper, you're going to leave some kind of mark. Now, that's a big advantage if we're doing things like salt and cling film and some of these really interesting techniques. But you don't want to just be randomly dabbing at your paper. I would avoid doing that in just about every instance. In third place, we have overworking or working too fast. I have a couple of comments about this. So Pint-Sized Stories says, not taking enough care with the drawing and trying to finish the painting in one go. So that's two separate things there. Now, not taking enough care about the drawing. I mean, you must have heard me on this channel bang on about this so often, because really watercolor, it's slightly adjustable, but you can't scrape the whole thing off like you can with an oil canvas. You can just scrape everything off and start again on the same canvas without any damage. But you can't do that with watercolor painting. And so it's really important that your drawing is good enough and that you're happy with the drawing before you start painting. You never ever want to think to yourself, well, the drawing's not great, but it'll get better when I put some paint on. That kind of optimism, I'm afraid, just doesn't work. It nearly always looks worse because the paint will highlight your mistakes. So whether it's one line that you need to place just for that horizon, or whether it's, a really complex drawing, always make sure you're happy with it before you start. Then what about overworking? This that habit, I think, with watercolorists and with amateur watercolorists, to sort of keep, it's almost like a car and they're just going to keep going until they crash it into a wall. As I said, you need to take breaks, you need to stop, and you need to think about your work. And when you get to that stage where you think to yourself, I'm not sure if it's finished or if it needs something else, for goodness sake, put it aside and look at it, preferably on another day, because when you've been really up close to your paintings for a long while, it becomes almost impossible to tell if they're any good or not, if they need anything else. You almost can't see the wood for the trees, so have a break, and when you look at that painting again, it will be much clearer to you whether it needs anything else or if it is in fact complete. Now, another comment I had this week on YouTube, I can't even remember, it probably wasn't on this community post, it may have been, or it may have been on another video, but I had a comment, I haven't written down the username, but I had a comment from somebody who said to me, oh, can you help me speed up? I'm not working fast enough. Fast enough for who? Fast enough for what? There's no correct amount of time to create a watercolor painting in. It can seem, we can watch a tutorial on YouTube where somebody creates a painting in half an hour. I guarantee there's a lot of cuts in that video. Or we can go to an art class and the teacher's teaching for an hour and a half. We thought we've got to get something finished by the end of it. But when you're working at home on your own, you really have got as much time as you want. It's far better to go a little bit slower. I once said on a Facebook post that I sometimes take up to 40 hours doing a painting. I was kind of mocked for that, but it's not at all unusual for professional artists to take days, weeks. I even saw an interview with an oil painter who said that he took up to 2 years to paint portraits. I mean, they were very large and they were oil paints, obviously. That doesn't mean it's wrong to do a quick painting either, but there is no right amount of time for a painting. It depends on the style, it depends on the artist, it depends on the subject, and so many other things, even things like the heat or humidity that you're working in, because here in the UK, we have to leave things to dry for a lot longer than you may have to leave them to dry if you live in a hot climate. So the moral to all of this is take as long as you need, don't rush anything. There are no prizes for the fastest painting. So in second place, and spoiler alert, we have a joint first place, but in second place, we have not letting things dry for long enough. So I have a comment from Mountains Know who says, drying time, I never picked up allowing plenty of time. I tried to do the piece in one go. And that's what we talked about in the last point, isn't it? Crashing things into a wall. Now, I love drying layers or sections overnight. Amazing things happen. They absolutely do. Now, it's really easy when you're watching a tutorial, including one of mine, and I say, well, we're going to let this piece dry now, and then, you know, it's just a second, it's just a cut in the video. You may not see that I go out for a walk, I go off and teach a martial arts class, because that's something I'm doing in my spare time now. Yes, they actually made me an instructor. It's shocking, isn't it? I may leave a painting fully until the next day or even a couple of days later. If I want something really, really bone dry, I'm going to leave it overnight, and it makes such a difference. Unless you're doing a really fast and really a very simple watercolor landscape, there's going to be a point when you just need to let things dry, particularly with landscapes, because you can end up with the whole painting just being wet. Now, there are exceptions to this rule. If you're painting a botanical painting, for example, and you had a vase with lots of little flowers in, you could potentially just keep going on that, because you would be able to sort of paint one flower. Whilst that was drying, you could move across and paint another flower or another petal. So on a subject like that, it's sometimes possible to, you know, go across the whole thing without stopping to allow it to dry, but you still are allowing areas to dry, and you really do need to do this. And if you look at your painting and it's all starting to get a bit out of control, particularly with landscapes, it's all starting to be a bit wet and a bit muddy, and you think, oh, I just want to finish it, I've just put those last shadows in, and then of course it all bleeds and runs, you don't get the sharpness that you want. You must learn to let things dry. As I said, the hotter the country you are in, the less time you can allow, but even so, you know, especially if you're working as I do with stretched paper on a board, that moisture has got right down sometimes into the top of the wood. Let things dry is something all professional artists do. It's going to make such a difference to your work. Of course, we're talking again about patience. So let's look at the first of our first place watercolor mistakes, because we have this joint amount, exactly the same amount of people said one thing and said another, and they were both very large numbers as well. And I'm going to do you a little painting demonstration with each one so that we can really try and get these most popular mistakes under control. So the first of our first places was using the incorrect amount of water. Now, it's astonishing to me how much people obsess about how much water to mix with things. I've seen videos on, people say they're very helpful about, whether it should be, a milk consistency, a water consistency, a butter consistency, and this helps people understand the water. I had one chap this week, forgive me if it was you, because I can't even remember if it was on YouTube or if it was in Facebook. I had one chap saying he actually got, a little syringe and measured out millimeters of water, and then he made swatches. Now, if you were to ask me, about the correct amount of water to put with my watercolor paints and how I thought about this and how I did this, if I was being 100% honest, I would tell you that I never give it a second thought. I just chuck some water on. Now, that's not helpful to you if this is a real problem for you. So I thought about this morning, and I thought to myself, I think the problem is actually that you're not doing enough once the paint and the water is on the paper to control the water levels, because I just chuck stuff on and then control it afterwards. And I think with some of you, you're almost a little bit nervous of manipulating the paint once it's on the paper. And so there becomes an obsession with getting the water levels right when you mix it with the paint and then putting it on the paper and sort of leaving it alone. So let me give you a little demonstration. I'm going to show you how to easily control how much water is on your paper and exactly what the paint is doing. So let's take a look. Let's go back to my swatching page and let's look now at water levels and controlling water, because far more important than how much water you mix on the palette is what you do with the paint once it's on the paper, and you can use your brush to manipulate that. So let's put some very wet paint down. I've got some very old peeling paint here. I'm trying to get away from these square palettes just because I've got too many paints now. So I'll probably keep this one because this one contains my essentials set. Let's mix quite a lot of water in there and we'll place it on the paper. Now, with this much water in, it's not going to dry evenly. Even on stretched paper, the paper's going to bow a little bit and the water's going to collect. You can see it collecting down here in this corner. So I'll take a rag or a piece of paper towel, and what I'll do is I'll just dry my brush slightly, and now I can lift out this water. So my brush is acting like a little vacuum cleaner to lift up the water. Now, if I want to be more aggressive, I can actually lift out a light mark here by pressing harder and wiping this paint up. I can also pre-wet an area. My water's a little bit pink here, and I can go in with paint that's got very little water in, but it's still got enough that it's going to spread out there. Now to stop that spreading, again, I'll rinse and dry my brush, and I can sweep along here and control that water, lift some of that water out. Now the thing to remember is that wet paint will always run into damp. So it's basic physics. The paint and the water, they want to seek a level, and so they want to spread out. So they'll spread across any areas that are less wet. Now, of course, if the paper's bone dry, like it is on this edge here, it can't go anywhere. There's no water for it to travel across. But if you've got paint that's damp, see, we've got paint here that's damp. If I put wet paint into this, it's going to spread like crazy. So I can do this on purpose. Let's put some paint down that's a little bit too strong. I didn't want it quite as dark as that. So again, I'll rinse my brush, and I've got a wet brush here. So initially I'm just going to agitate a little bit and just start lifting some of that colour out. Remember that any area that you want to dry even and flat, you need to make sure it has even water levels. And that may mean taking the paintbrush across an area that you're not actually needing to adjust, just so that you can make sure those water levels are even. And here I've lightened that area. I can also, if I want to, apply some paint. I'm dipping into clean water now, and I've sort of semi-dried my brush, and I can start to blend that edge out. Perhaps this end isn't dark enough, so I'm going to go in with some paint that's a bit drier, because that way I know it won't spread too far. And we're manipulating the paint after it's on the paper to get the effects that we want. Now this is the point where people say, oh, well, you make it look so easy, Michelle. It's just practice and just beginning to learn and understand the different techniques. I do have lots of free videos on this channel. I also have several online watercolor courses that will teach you all of these basic water control techniques. But most of all, I want you to stop obsessing about how much water you mix in your palette initially, and start concentrating more about being a bit freer and worrying about it a bit less, chucking things on and then adjusting them as you need to. And one thing you shouldn't do is to take your rag or paper towel and dab at your paper, because that will leave marks, and they may not be the kind of marks that you want. So what was joint first place? What was the top mistake that people were making? And the joint first place was using cheap materials, and people were astonished at how much difference this made to their work. And Cindy Lou Who, great username, she said using cheap chalky watercolors and bad paper. So I'm going to point the camera downwards and let's have a talk about materials, because you do not need top of the range, but nor should you be using cheap rubbish. Now let's talk about supplies. There's only 3 areas we really have to think about: brushes, paper and paints. Most people would tend to put paper as the most important one of those. I'd actually put paint as the most important, because really it's the thing that's left for you to look at the end of the day. Brushes I would put last in importance. When it comes to brushes, all you've really got to worry about is that the very cheap ones will just molt and drop a load of hairs on your paper. Of course, the better the brush, the easier it is to paint. I actually don't use expensive brushes at all. This is one from my brush set made by Jackman's. These are synthetic watercolor brushes that I like because they've got quite a nice amount of spring. I don't use animal hair brushes myself for ethical reasons. But regardless, you don't want to get those very cheap packs of brushes. It's much better to buy one good brush. I do have a video on this channel which will tell you the brushes that I use most often. You can start with just one brush. I have a set of 3 that I sell, and I've got a video that will tell you my 5 brushes that I use all the time. One of those will be something that I guarantee you have for free in your house. So don't obsess too much about brushes. Just make sure you have a decent one that has a good point and isn't going to shed hair. Let's talk next about paper, and this is a controversial subject. I'm painting these swatches today on some very cheap practice paper. Now, in my background, I did a lot of demonstrating, art fairs, art clubs, and also art shops, and sometimes, by which I mean supply shops, sometimes I was just asked to demonstrate in a certain type of paint, like we want you to use Daniel Smith watercolors today. Michelle, we need you to use this De La Roni practice paper today. I just used whatever it was and I got on with it and I had a decent result. So thinking about paper, a lot of people will tell you that the best paper is Arches watercolor paper. Now, it's certainly very good if you get on with it and if you can afford it, that's lovely. I find it a little bit too absorbent. It's not my favourite. There are many good brands of paper. And actually, practice paper isn't too bad. Now, what people say caused the biggest change to their painting was changing from a cellulose paper like this, a wood pulp paper basically, and changing up to a cotton paper. So what's the difference? Now, you won't find a lot of difference between the actual application of the paint. Where you find the most difference is actually in the resilience, in the scrubbing out. You can't scrub out much on a cheap paper. And I'll give you an example here, just while we're talking. I'll start scrubbing at this. And what you'll notice happens after a few minutes, because this is a cheap practice paper, is that the paper starts to lift. I don't know if you can see it there, but those little dark bits there are actually physically paper coming up. So if you can't afford very expensive paper, what's your strategy? The first thing is, for goodness sake, stretch your paper. Cheaper papers tend to be thinner and you can really improve their performance by stretching them. I've got a really easy paper stretching video. I'll leave that in the description of this video. It's cheap, it's very quick to do. Don't believe all the nonsense about it being time consuming. It's really very quick once you get the hang of it, and it's not at all difficult to do. So stretch your paper if you're working on a practice paper. The other thing is to make sure that you've got your drawing right, because as we've seen, although the paint applied well, as soon as I started to try and adjust it and rub it and lift it out, the paper behaved very badly indeed. So if you're having to paint on practice paper, or if you just want to paint on cheaper paper whilst you're learning, the strategies are to stretch your paper and to make sure that your drawing is correct. You don't do a lot of erasing, so you could perhaps draw on a separate piece of paper and then transfer across. Make sure everything is ready to go, and don't scrub your paper too much. When you can afford it, move up to a cotton paper. But do understand that Arches is by no means the only brand. I'm currently painting for my own paintings on Fabriano Artistico. Saunders Waterford is another good brand, but there are many good brands. So let's talk now about paints. So I've got some cheap paints here. I won't tell you the brand, but cheap paints basically are a disaster. They have a lot of fillers in, which means they are very chalky and they have very little pigment in. Whatever you are buying, and you may have seen some of these cheaper brands, and you can get, 72 watercolor pencils for £20 or something, where a decent watercolor pencil would cost about £4. So what's missing? It's not the packaging, which is often very nice, it's the pigment. Pigment is the expensive part, and you'll always get less of it when you're using drugstore or very, very cheap paints. I'm going to swatch 3 levels of paints here. I'm going to swatch these very cheap paints. I'm going to swatch this one here, which is a Russian brand. So this is White Nights by St. Petersburg. This is, they would call them an artist brand, but most people consider them to be a student's brand, but they are good. They punch above their weight, and I'll swatch a professional for you. And we're going to choose the same color for each one so you can see the difference. And I'm going to choose ultramarine, or what I think in this set looks like ultramarine. Actually, it could be this one here, couldn't it? Let's have a try. So let's first of all swatch our unbranded drugstore or stationer's paint, and this color definitely looks to me like a French ultramarine. You may notice as it dries it goes rather chalky, and that's because of all the fillers in it. Let's try our St. Petersburg White Nights. So straight away you can see, there's a difference in the actual type of color, but you can see that it's much stronger. And lastly, I've got a sample of French ultramarine from Jackman's. So let's try this one. And again, we have a nice strength of colour. I'm actually going to swatch another blue from the cheap set. That may have been a purple there, though it looks like it could be a French ultramarine. Let's try this one. Maybe this is a cobalt. Cobalt and ultramarine are fairly close in colour. But let's try this one as well, just to give it a fair run. I'll pop it here. Now you can see, as well as being weaker in colour, they haven't applied very evenly, and that's because probably of the levels of binder in there and chalk. It's not anything to do with the way I've applied them. I tried to make them as neat as the others, but you can see they just don't apply as well. They haven't got the colour strength. Now let's look at these other two. There's a world of difference between these cheap drugstore paints and the Students brand here. it's not far off being as good as the artist brand, although the artist brand is definitely better. And I've chosen ultramarine. Now, ultramarine's a very expensive pigment. When it comes to cheaper pigments, such as earth pigments like yellow ochre, you may find that your student's brand is almost as good as your artist quality brand. So if you're starting out, there's nothing wrong with using a student's brand. My favourite is this St. Petersburg White Nights paint. My least favourite would be Cotman. Sorry, Winsor & Newton, but it's universally bad, at least compared to other students' brands. Although Winsor & Newton professional range are indeed very good, but there seems to be quite a gap there. But any student's brand is going to be a world of difference away from these cheap drugstore brands. And you can see just what a difference this is going to make. So it may be controversial, but when you finish your painting, no one's going to know what paper you used and no one's going to know what brush you used, but the paint remains on full display. Do let me know in the comments if these mistakes resonated with you, if I've managed to help give you a little bit of clarity today. If there are any other mistakes that you make regarding watercolours, perhaps we need a second video. And before you leave this video, don't forget to have a look in the video description. I've got loads of free stuff down there for you. And if you're watching this video when it's just come out, we are going to be having a little landscape challenge in a week or two. It's completely free and you're going to be painting along with me from Monday to Friday. I'm going to have a different, very simple landscape for you to do every single day, so watch out for that one. Meantime, all the watercolour help in the world won't get you where you need to be going if your drawing isn't any good, but the good news is that we can all learn to draw a little bit better than we can draw today. I'll leave one of my popular drawing videos for you to watch right now.